a story titled They Are No Longer Humans. Enjoy listening. Previously, a chilly autumn arrived, with convulsive hints of the last warm days. Some green crowns had already embraced September's golden hues, and people, who not long ago complained about the heat, were now grumbling about the dampness, and hiding their pampered bodies under layers of clothing. Soon, what they still called an Indian summer would fully transition. The flora would shed its multicolored leaves, the earth would be repeatedly soaked by cold rains, and eventually, it would all be covered by a mix of snow and sticky mud. But as frost set in, the snow would finally settle and remain until the next warmth arrived in mid-March. On his way home, Hank was avoiding puddles. Although it was midday, he had already finished his shift. A sturdy young man, Hank worked as a driver-deliverman for a transportation company, primarily distributing groceries and occasionally household chemicals. His workday started at 5 in the morning, and by around 3 in the afternoon, he was usually free, a schedule he found more than satisfactory. An avid sports enthusiast mindful of his health, Hank enjoyed spending his free time at the gym, which made his work hours particularly appealing. He was walking along a nearby street when his attention was caught by a stranger about 40 meters ahead. The middle-aged man slowed his pace, staggered a few times, then suddenly grabbed a road sign and froze. Hank quickened his steps, thinking the man might need help, especially since the stranger had let go of the pole, squatted down, and was now clutching his head while howling plaintively. Not being particularly knowledgeable in medicine, Hank assumed the man was either having a heart attack or experiencing a sudden spike in blood pressure. He nearly broke into a run but slowed down about 10 meters away and even took a couple of steps back. The stranger threw his head back, roared like an animal, got on all fours, arched his back, and began crawling toward a nearby sports field, occasionally shuddering and emitting low growls. Hank put his hands on his hips, spat on the asphalt, and muttered with disdain, "Damn junkie, when will you all just drop dead already?" Crossing the street, he entered his courtyard. The young man lived in a rare type of building for their area, St. Sign Lakes Gaylord Ton. This unique design featured a square courtyard surrounded by closely placed multi-story buildings. In a block layout, entrances faced inward, and access to the courtyard was through arch-like tunnels. From the street, climbing to apartment number 8 on the second floor, Hank quickly had lunch and lay down for a nap before his workout. After the gym, he hurried home as a cold, unpleasant rain had started. Hank wasn't so much afraid of getting wet as of catching a cold. A body warmed by exercise is particularly susceptible to colds, and he avoided late meals, preferring to go to bed early, no later than 9 o'clock. While bustling around in the kitchen, he glanced out the window and froze for a few seconds, forgetting what he had been doing. In the courtyard, under the pouring rain, several neighbors stood with their heads tilted back and mouths wide open. It looked as if they were drinking the rain, or rather, acting as vessels for it. When the water overflowed, they would swallow, shudder, and open their mouths again for more, seemingly oblivious to the cold and wet. Hank watched the strange scene for about 10 minutes before waving it off and returning to his preparations, deciding that the neighbors were just drunk and engaging in some silly challenge, typical of alcoholics. "They'll catch pneumonia, and that'll knock the nonsense out of them," he muttered. Like most health-conscious people, Hank was meticulous about his well-being, adhering to a proper diet, a strict sleep schedule, and drinking only pure bottled water. But the oddities didn't stop. On the contrary, they escalated. While delivering goods to various locations, Hank noticed more and more bizarre behavior among the townspeople. Some crawled on all fours with arched backs like cats, others sniffed trees and bushes, and one well-dressed woman first licked a drain pipe, then crouched down, dropped her branded handbag into the mud, and began drinking water from a puddle. She did it with such pleasure that it seemed like the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. An elderly man with the demeanor of a philosophy professor tried to stop her, but the strange woman shrieked, leapt to her feet, and bit the pensioner's right hand, the one he had placed on her shoulder, in an attempt to bring her to her senses. The scream was so loud that even Hank, driving his car with the windows closed, heard it. It seemed as though people were going mad, yet there were no ambulances or police patrols on the streets, as if the city's authorities had silently sanctioned the chaos. Shrugging it off as Autumn exacerbating mental health issues, Hank hurried to his last stop and tried to ignore the erratic behavior of individuals around him. After all, autumn was known as the hardest season for those with psychological problems. At his final delivery point, Hank decided to buy a drink, opting for lemon-flavored water. He joined the queue. The cashier was briskly ringing up items when a frightened scream came from a neighboring room. A moment later, a colleague of the cashier burst out in a panic. Everything came to a halt, and seconds later, the cause of her distress appeared, a thin, disheveled elderly woman wearing a dirty bathrobe. She advanced toward the young cashier, her hands outstretched. "She's not herself. Kate, call security," stammered the frightened cashier, hiding behind the sturdier colleague. The latter, however, decided to speak with the old woman, approaching her gently and taking her hands. "What?" Hank muttered, staring at his phone in disbelief. The response seemed too rehearsed, too dismissive, especially given the bizarre substance he had just seen swirling in his water. He glanced back at the pitcher, still sitting on the table, and the unsettling spiral of slime with its ominous black dots. He leaned in closer, squinting. The movement of the substance wasn't random, it almost looked intentional. The little black specks, which resembled eyes, seemed to follow his gaze as he tilted the pitcher slightly. A chill ran down his spine. "Safe to drink, my ass," he grumbled. With a sigh, Hank dumped the contents into the sink, watching as the strange gelatinous mass clung to the steel surface before reluctantly washing away with a gush of water. He scrubbed the sink furiously with soap, as if trying to erase any trace of what he'd just seen. Still feeling uneasy, he decided to brush it off and headed to the living room to distract himself. Without much thought, he decided to break his routine just this once and drink tap water, letting it settle in a carafe first. Most customers had long fled the store, but Hank, being a responsible citizen, stayed at the scene to give his account of what had happened. Soon, the police arrived, but neither they nor the paramedics bothered to take his details or even listen to him. The old woman died in the ambulance from internal bleeding, her face still fixed in that same blissful smile. After parking his truck in the garage, Hank took the trolley bus home, unable to stop himself from observing the people around him. Strangely, no one was acting out of the ordinary. It seemed the bizarre behavior only occurred during the mornings and evenings. But as he flipped through TV channels, his thoughts kept circling back to the strange events of the day, the crazed old woman, the eerie behavior of the townsfolk, and now this thing in his water. "Just autumn nerves," he muttered to himself, turning the volume up on a sports channel. But even the commentator's excited voice couldn't drown out his growing sense of unease. A loud knock at the door startled him. Hank jumped up, heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone. Hesitant, he approached the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the hallway. No answer. He opened the door cautiously, peeking outside. The corridor was empty, save for a faint trail of muddy footprints leading away from his apartment. They stopped abruptly at the staircase, as if whoever had left them had vanished into thin air. Hank's grip tightened on the door handle. He glanced back into his apartment, where everything suddenly seemed too quiet, too still. "Get it together," he muttered, closing the door firmly and locking it. He resolved to go to bed early, hoping to shake off the day's unease. But as he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, the strange events replayed in his mind. The old woman's glass-eating grin, the neighbor's drinking rain, the oily, spiraling sludge. Just as he was about to drift off, a faint tapping sound reached his ears. It came from the direction of the kitchen. Tap, tap, tap. His eyes shot open, and his breath quickened. Grabbing his phone for light, he cautiously got out of bed and made his way toward the noise. The pitcher was back on the table, but Hank knew he had thrown it into the sink. The faint glint of black dots in the water caught his eye. The substance was back, swirling again in that same deliberate spiral, and then, almost imperceptibly, it shifted, pressing against the inside of the glass like it was trying to get out. Hank froze, his mind racing. Then, with trembling hands, he grabbed the pitcher, carried it to the bathroom, and poured its contents into the toilet. Flushing repeatedly, he watched as the slime resisted the water's pull, clinging to the porcelain It took several flushes before it finally disappeared. Breathing heavily, Hank sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the empty toilet bowl. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, this wasn't over. Somewhere in the pipes, deep below the city, the thing swirled onward, joining countless others, like it, waiting. What happened to you? Why are you upset? The old woman pulled her hands away and, gesturing wildly, blinking incessantly, began to squeak out her words. They are already here. They will kill us, become us. We're nothing but puppets to them. And you're the devil's servants. They're lackeys, feeding young children to them, spreading their young spawn, you traitorous Judases. In a manner quite uncharacteristic for her age, the old woman swiftly darted between the shelves, past the cashier and her colleague, grabbed a bottle of lemonade, smashed it against a freezer, and fashioned a makeshift rose out of the broken glass. The store filled with frightened female screams, the hiss of soda, and the clinking of shattered glass. The young cashier was the only one screaming. The rest were stunned into silence, slowly backing away from the crazed woman. Kate, muttering curses under her breath, rushed back to the cash register, pressed the panic button, and sternly declared, "Fine, you want it this way? Then so be it. The security guys will be here soon, and they'll set things straight." But the deranged woman wasn't planning to wait for security. Her glassy eyes scanned the surroundings. Her bluish lips stretched into a foolish smile, and she trembled a few times before stuttering out her words. No, only by my rules. They're inside, they'll be inside, like in a little house. But I don't want them inside me. I'll fix it for them." Throwing aside the makeshift weapon, she fell to her knees and began to eat the broken glass, scooping it up from the floor with her hands. Snapping out of their initial shock, the men in the store tried to restrain her, but she clawed at the shards with bloody hands, stuffing them into her mouth. The crunch of glass echoed as she chewed and swallowed. Blood poured from her mouth in streams, and it became visible how the jagged pieces slid down her throat, tearing her thin, elderly skin as they went, leaving deep cuts on her neck. An ambulance was immediately called. By the time the paramedics arrived, the old woman was lying by the spice shelf, clutching her stomach with a blissful smile on her face. The floor was drenched in her blood, now thickened and darkened. Behind the cash register sat the younger cashier, trembling in fear, quietly sobbing. Her colleague futilely tried to calm her down. Passing by the store in his neighborhood, Hank glanced at it a few times, feeling as though he had forgotten to buy something. The incident with the old woman had completely driven all other thoughts from his mind. Only after entering his apartment and checking his fridge did he remember he was running out of bottled water, which he had planned to buy at the nearby store. Exhausted from the incident at the store, Hank didn't even feel like going to the gym. Placing the clear carafe in the sink, he turned on the faucet and went to the bedroom. He allowed her to embrace him, and Alice rested her head on his shoulder, bursting into sobs. When Hank approached within a couple of meters, he tried to look her in the eye and gently asked, "Alice, that's your name, right?" He caught himself asking a stupid question. Who else would it be? "Alice, do you need help? Are you feeling unwell? Should I call an ambulance? My stomach hurts a lot," Alice managed to say through her tears. She reached out her hands and began walking toward him, but he immediately froze in place. The faucet was rattling violently, buzzing, and then, as if sneezing during a pressure test, began to spray water in fits and starts. The crystal carafe toppled onto its side, miraculously, not shattering. Swearing at the utilities workers, Hank righted the carafe and let the water run for a while. The rebellious faucet continued to act up for 5 minutes before it seemed to collect itself, loudly hissed, and returned to normal. Filling the carafe, Hank placed it on the table and went to eat in the living room. After his meal, he decided to make tea. Picking up the carafe, he immediately set it back down and leaned in closer. In the water, faintly glistening, was a barely noticeable clump of transparent slime. Hank might not have noticed it at all, had it not been for the tiny black dots resembling tadpole eyes. The strange substance was moving in a slow spiral. Not overthinking it, Hank grabbed his phone, searched online for the local water treatment plant's contact number, and called. The call was only picked up after a dozen rings. "Hello? I'm calling from East Street. I just filled some water, and there's this. I don't know. Slime or clumps with black dots floating in it. It looks like it's moving on its own. Don't you treat the water or what? Hello, are you there? There was silence on the other end for a few moments before a pleasant female voice replied. Hello, thank you for your concern. We've already addressed your issue. Yes, there was a small blockage, but it has been resolved. The water is completely safe now. Please enjoy your day. And with that, the line went dead. What? Hank muttered, staring at the phone in disbelief. The task annoyed the young man. It seemed to him that they had sent him off in the most polite way possible, and he muttered to himself, glancing at the darkened phone screen, "Drink this crap yourselves. You've really lost it." Not particularly eager, he dressed slowly and headed to the store. At the checkout, he noticed a familiar cashier and smiled as he greeted her, but she didn't react. As usual, just nodded in response. Typically, Kara, a rather large woman in her 40s, would melt into a mischievous grin upon seeing him, openly flirting despite the presence of other customers, calling him Hank and throwing out compliments. Maybe she's mad about something, thought the young man as he walked into another aisle. After standing in line and placing a bottle of water on the checkout counter, he greeted her politely again, but Kara acted as though she didn't know him. As she rang up his purchase, she spoke, almost as if to herself, "Better not buy bottled water. On TV, they said capitalist spies are injecting it with some kind of impotence-inducing poison. It's safer to drink our own tap water." After paying, Hank hurried home. On his way, he noticed his neighbor crawling on all fours in a flower bed. It was Alex, the head of the auto depot, wearing trousers and a shirt, now covered in dirt and grass as he frantically searched for something. Wanting to help, Hank approached the man and greeted him. "Hello, Uncle Alex. Did you lose something?" But the neighbor, absorbed in his task, didn't respond. Hank greeted him again, but Alex ignored him. Just as Hank decided to leave, Alex suddenly shouted triumphantly and began digging furiously, uprooting yellow gerberas. A moment later, he plunged his hand into the soil and, with a predatory gleam in his eyes, pulled out a squealing mouse. Hank was speechless, trying to process what might happen next, but Alex shocked him further. The neighbor sniffed the screeching rodent and began hungrily licking it, smearing his face and tongue with dirt and fur. Cursing in astonishment, Hank hurried home, convinced that everyone around him was losing their minds. That evening, he again noticed people drinking rainwater, only this time there were far more of them. Many were filling buckets and basins, and makeshift reservoirs, mostly made from cut-up plastic bottles, appeared on several balconies. After preparing his meal for the next day, Hank went to bed, but replaying the events of recent days in his mind, he only managed to fall asleep 3 hours later. When he woke up, he felt broken. His nerves and lack of sleep were catching up with him, breaking yet another of his own rules. Hank skipped his usual breakfast of oatmeal with bananas and instead opted for 2 cups of unsweetened coffee. Reluctantly, he got ready for work and left the house, forgetting his packed meal. As he walked through the courtyard, strange sounds came from the dark right-hand tunnel. Someone was moaning in pain. Looking closer, he saw a thin female figure leaning against the wall, trembling all over. Hank called out to the stranger a couple of times, but she didn't respond. Recalling the events of the past few days, Hank glanced toward the exit of the courtyard and took a few steps in that direction, but his gentlemanly upbringing got the better of him. Continuing to ask if she needed help, he slowly approached the woman standing with her back to him, but she still didn't react, only moaned in agony, clutching her stomach with one hand and the brick wall with the other. Looking closer, he saw messy red hair tied in a ponytail, with its tip dyed white. It was his neighbor from the opposite building, Alice Lisa, a flighty young woman known for her reputation as a partying, drinking single mom. Hank called her by name, and she stopped trembling. Not knowing what to expect, he asked her to step into the light. Nodding, the unfortunate woman obeyed. Hank stepped back, then scolded himself internally. Afraid of some skinny girl? And a sick one at that? He stroked her head, trying to comfort her, saying he'd call an ambulance and that they would help her. But at that moment, a faint squeaking sound reached his ears. It seemed to be coming from inside Alice. Hank tried to gently push her away, but she clung to him tightly. Suddenly, she turned sharply and leaned in as if to kiss him. When she opened her mouth, the squeaking grew louder. Disregarding all notions of decency, Hank forcefully pushed her away. She stumbled over her own feet and fell onto all fours. The girl arched her back like an enraged cat, retching violently. A few tense, empty moments passed before blood gushed from Alice's mouth onto the gray asphalt, foaming as it spewed like a fountain. The girl twitched several times, screamed in pain, and then rolled her eyes back as her mouth opened unnaturally wide. Even though she was in a kneeling position, Hank noticed her throat beginning to swell, significantly from the base upward, as if something was slowly crawling out, tearing through her esophagus. Moments later, a head resembling that of an ant emerged from her mouth, emitting a shrill screech that echoed across the courtyard. Paralyzed by a wave of sticky terror, Hank stood frozen, unable to move. The parasite screeched again before swiftly exiting the host's body. Standing upright on its hind legs, the creature stared at Boris with its glossy black eyes. The bizarre entity resembled an elongated, brown spider with an ant-like head and 4 black appendages extending from each cheek. Its antennae straightened, twitched in a wave-like motion a few times, and then folded against its body. The creature crouched low to the ground, squeaked briefly, and disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. By that time, Alice was lying on her back on the asphalt, showing no signs of life. Her stomach, however, shifted and moved, emitting muffled squeaks. It seemed as if something else was still inside her. Recovering from the initial shock, Hank fled the courtyard but stopped, remembering the potential legal implications. He cursed aloud, walked a safe distance away, and called the local police department without taking his eyes off the girl's body. Within seconds, someone picked up, tripping over his words. Hank hastily reported, "I was on my way to work, and there's a girl, she's dead. Or, well, she died right in front of me. Her name's Alice. I think she's my neighbor or something." She was holding her stomach, then started vomiting blood, and then some kind of thing crawled out of her mouth. I don't know what it was. A bug? A spider? "Citizen, please compose yourself and clearly explain what happened," the dispatcher interrupted. "Right, okay. I was walking to work, heard strange noises, moaning. I approached and asked if she needed help. She didn't respond at first, but when I called her by name, she agreed. Then she doubled over and started vomiting blood. After that, some large insect-like thing crawled out of her mouth. I think she's dead, but I didn't check. I didn't get close. Maybe she's alive and needs help. She's lying there, and her stomach's still moving." "Where is the entity that exited the victim?" the dispatcher asked, their tone growing colder and more detached. "I don't know. It ran off somewhere toward the exit of the courtyard, maybe into the basement. There are basement entrances on that side. Possibly the basement. They require damp environments," the dispatcher muttered, almost to themselves, before continuing, "Remain on site. A patrol will arrive shortly. Do not approach the body or attempt to kill any other specimens. If they emerge, they are highly valuable. Wait for the team." The call ended abruptly. Hank found it odd that the officials hadn't even asked for his personal information or more about the girl's condition. Within 5 minutes, however, a vehicle drove into the courtyard, not a police car, but one belonging to the FBR. Hank was briefly questioned and then invited into the car. A thin, pale officer asked him, "Where is the entity that emerged?" "I already told your people, it ran off. Maybe into the tunnel or the basement. There's access to the basements on that side." "Into the basement? Possibly. They like moisture," the officer muttered, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He then turned to Boris and said sternly, "Citizen, we're taking you to the station for a statement. Don't worry about the deceased. Medical personnel are on their way. It's obvious she's dead. No need to confirm it. We'll head to the station. You'll write your report quickly, and I'll personally drive you to work afterward." Hank nodded in agreement, and the patrol car exited the courtyard. As soon as the vehicle's lights disappeared and Hank was out of sight, dozens of creatures tore through Alice's abdomen. They scanned their surroundings briefly before scurrying into the building's basement. During the drive, the officers remained silent, occasionally exchanging glances and nodding as if communicating wordlessly, which only deepened Hank's unease. Suspicion crept into his mind, and his fears were confirmed when the car turned in the opposite direction from the police station. "Why are we going this way?" Hank asked, his voice tinged with panic. The officer in the passenger seat drew a pistol and ordered him to stay still. Then, he cuffed Hank's wrists to the car door handle. The doors locked automatically. Boris, a strong young man, tugged at the cuffs, but the cold barrel of a pistol pressed against his temple discouraged further resistance. "Don't worry, comrade, you're valuable to the Soviet Union," the officer said dryly. Hank, a law-abiding and responsible citizen, found himself trapped. He stared helplessly out the window as they drove toward a water treatment plant. Upon arrival, he was dragged out of the car, his hands cuffed behind his back. Under the threat of the pistol, they escorted him into the facility's workshops. The young man looked around, horrified. The infestation had spread further than he'd imagined. Nearly all the station workers were acting bizarrely. Some drank water directly from sedimentation pools, others licked the damp walls, and yet others crawled on all fours, lugging canisters filled with some yellow liquid. Each seemed wholly absorbed in their tasks, oblivious to his presence. As Hank entered the main chamber, his legs turned to jelly, and he froze in place, paralyzed by terror. Before him loomed an enormous creature, perched above a vat of purified water. The grotesque being was nearly 3 meters tall, resembling a bloated locust with an ant's head. From its cheeks protruded 4 black, wiry tendrils covered in tiny bristles. It sat in an unsettlingly human posture, its spindly limbs dangling over the edge of its perch. Dozens of swollen glands lined its abdomen, each using a viscous white fluid that dripped into the vats below, contaminating the water. The queen insect turned its bulging eyes toward Hank, then shifted its gaze to the sergeant who had escorted him. The soldier gave a curt nod and struck Boris hard in the gut with the butt of his pistol. Hank crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. His hair was grabbed roughly, his head yanked back, and his mouth forced open. A worker appeared from the shadows, holding a squirming parasite by its tail. Without hesitation, the creature was shoved into Hank's throat. The soldier struck his diaphragm again, ensuring he inhaled sharply, swallowing the writhing invader whole. Pain exploded in Hank's chest as the parasite embedded itself, its tendrils latching onto his organs. Heat radiated from within him, and his vision swam. He collapsed, convulsing violently. Pink foam bubbled from his mouth, and his eyes rolled back in his head. Then, his mind was flooded with horrifying visions. He saw the infestation spreading through the district, parasites overrunning the water treatment plant, clinics, and police stations. He saw their history. Decades ago, during the Soviet era, these creatures had attempted to take over, only to be thwarted by the FBR, forcing them into dormancy underground. Now, with weaker oversight and widespread negligence, they had resurfaced. He saw how the parasites fed their queen with a strange, sugary liquid, and how infected individuals licked walls and drank rainwater, unable to consume their own kind. Protein came from the host's bodies, and the stronger the host, the more offspring they could bear. When a host's immune system failed, like Vera's, weakened by undiagnosed HIV, the parasites abandoned them, as they had her. But now, Hank was no longer human. He was part of the collective mind, a vessel for their shared purpose. He had no need for instructions. He knew his role instinctively. Days later, Hank returned to work. His colleagues noticed his newfound silence and distant demeanor. During a delivery, he stopped in a desolate area, opened the truck's cargo, and began injecting bottles of water with an invisible parasite-infused fluid. The queen's adaptations had rendered her offspring so small they were undetectable. At his final delivery stop, in his own neighborhood, he was unloading crates when a familiar voice called out. Turning, he saw an old classmate with her young daughter. They exchanged pleasantries until the child tugged at her mother's hand, whispering that she was thirsty. "Hank, do you have any water?" the woman asked. Nodding, Hank handed over a bottle from his stash. The girl hesitated, hiding behind her mother. "Don't be shy," the woman chuckled. "Uncle Hank always drinks clean water. He's a health nut. Go on." Reassured, the girl took a few gulps but soon coughed, her hand brushing her throat. "It tickles, like a weird little bug," she murmured. The adults laughed it off. The mother, dismissing her daughter's complaint, took a sip herself. Hank smiled. "Have a great day," he said, climbing into his truck. As he drove off, he glanced back at them one last time. "Goodbye," he muttered, his voice laced with cold finality. And don't forget to stay hydrated.